You. All right, so I told them a little bit about you. I didn't tell much because I don't know a lot about what you do. So I'm really excited to hear this conversation as well. Just go ahead and start with who you are and a little bit about what you do.
So my name is Marah Ernest. I'm the teacher of the gifted. I'm the East Area Itinerant Teacher of the Gifted this year. There's a couple of us. Itinerant just means that I'm moving from school to school. At this current point, I'm at Ridge Community High School. I'm at Haines City High School, Haines City IB, and then I'm actually sitting at Boone Middle School right now. So you might hear some of their bells going off because they have a shorter schedule. But those are the three schools that I'm at. Those adjust and ebb and flow based on where there are different vacancies in the district as far as where there may or may not be teachers of the gifted. So for example, at Daniel Jenkins Academy, I covered some of their classes, some of their gifted students earlier this year. And then Davenport School of the Arts, I kind of helped out with that as well. So to kind of like go backwards a little bit, when I went to Florida Southern College, I have my degree in history and actually a secondary in secondary education. I went through the certification program. When I first started teaching, I actually taught at Boone Middle School, 2 years doing civics, and then I left for a brief period. I worked in charter school for about 2 months, and then I wanted to come back into Polk County. I was like, well, I kind of want to come back into Polk. It's where I'm comfortable. I kind of wanted to come back. And so at that time at Daniel Jenkins Academy, the principal that I previously worked with, he was the new principal there. And so he was like, well, I have a gifted position open. And I was like, I don't know anything about gifted. And he was like, well, just come interview. So I interview. I got the job. I started in September and I had no idea what gifted was going to be. So what gifted is, as far as a teacher certification, is you have to have a teaching certificate. So my certificate is social studies 6 through 12, but what you do is you add an endorsement onto it. So I'm gifted and endorsed, which is 6 different classes at about 60 hours that I've added onto my certificate. So every 5 years when I renew my teaching certificate, I have to add that gifted endorsement back on there. I just have to renew it just like I would my normal certificate. So when I first started, I was at Daniel Jenkins Academy. I was at Lake Alfred before it was Lake Alfred Polytech, and I was at Boone Middle School. So I was itinerant. I moved to different schools when I first started. And as that's gone on, I'm in this position now. This is my first year where I'm doing different high schools. But basically, it kind of stays the same. I work specifically with the gifted students. The paperwork that I work on, it says that there are different types of gifted services that can happen. There's something called a differentiated curriculum, where there is a teacher in the classroom who's certified for gifted that will teach gifted students and non-gifted students. There is an enriched curriculum where typically a teacher is going to pull out students that are gifted to work on different projects. A lot of elementary schools in this area, they work and do that pull-out program where they actually take the kids out. They might have like cool activities they might do, like STEM, or I know like Loftman Oaks is really big into like 3D printing and their ITV program. So that's another program. But the services that I actually carry out as a teacher of the gifted is consultation. So consultation means that I'm talking monthly with teachers. I'm communicating with teachers on how to differentiate for their students that are gifted. I'm keeping an eye on those students' grades, basically just being a resource for everyone, for teachers so they can understand what it means to be gifted. For parents who maybe are having trouble with those students because there's some different idiosyncrasies with gifted students, and then for the students themselves, so they can better make sure that they're being successful, that they're reaching different goals that they want to do. So that's kind of, I always say like I'm a really big advocate for that student and making sure everybody's speaking the same language to make sure everyone's making a successful path for that student. So that's
really interesting.
It really is. And I have discovered, this is my 8th year teaching, I've discovered a lot of people just don't really know what gifted is. Sometimes when I talk to teachers and I'm like, hey, I need to come, I do something called a consultation log, where I just fill out comments based on what they're saying about the students, about like their progress, academically, socially, and emotionally. And a lot of times they're like, I don't understand what this is. Mm-hmm. So I do try to kind of be that bridgeway between So as far as what Gifted is, so Gifted is a national program. The name changes based on the state. Some states call it GATE, Gifted and Talented Education. Some kids keep it as Gifted. Some states keep it as Gifted. There is a national organization called the National Association for Gifted Education. They do have a conference every year. It was supposed to be at Disney this year, but obviously because of COVID, it's virtual. But it is a national organization. What it means to be gifted is this is a student, and again, this kind of changes from state to state, but the Florida definition is this is a student that is being tested and their IQ level is anywhere from a 120 or above.
Okay.
So how that works is there's a specific way that you refer students. Sometimes a teacher will talk to like a teacher of the gifted and be like, hey, I think this kid might be gifted. So the preliminary assessment, we give an intellectual assessment the teachers of the gifted do. It's called a KBIT 2 in Polk County. It is an intellectual assessment which judges the verbal and nonverbal skills of students. So that composite score based on that has to be at least a 120 or above. Then from that point, what we do is we have the teacher fill out a gifted characteristics checklist. So this is other than just the pure IQ things as far as intellect. This can be things as the way, like if they're very intuitive, if they can have an understanding of maybe further what's going on in the classroom. They fill out this gifted characteristics checklist, and then we fill out paperwork to actually refer the student over to a school psychologist.
Oh.
And then from there, the school psychologist gives another intellectual assessment. And based on that score, the teacher of the gifted, the school psychologist, the parents, and then someone who's called an LEA, which is basically a learning advocate, and then a regular education teacher, we all meet together and then we discuss, do we think based on this criteria, based on like the characteristics checklist, based on the IQ assessments, is this child meeting the criteria for gifted? Yes or no? So there's two different ways. There's a plan A and a plan B with gifted. Plan A, the student has to score at least a 130 or above on both IQ assessments. So that's very high. That's a very high IQ score. That is when you start getting up into the 40s and or 140s and 150s. Those are the people that when you talk to them, you just kind of blankly stare because usually their language is so high up there, you don't even know what they're talking about anymore. That's sometimes who those gifted kids are. We also have a plan B. This is statewide, but in Polk County. The plan B option is for students who may have scored like a 120 to like a 129 on the IQ assessments, but maybe English isn't their first language. Maybe as they're taking these assessments, maybe there's things that they just don't know what that word is. And we can't give them a dictionary to say, okay, let me translate this back and forth in my native language. It also can be for like a socioeconomic status. So if the student maybe they haven't really had stable housing during their life, maybe their family is just going through, I know right now, a lot of families are going through a really hard time. So economically, if they're struggling, they're not getting those same educational choices and opportunities that some other kids are. So we take that into account. If they were given all those same opportunities, would they have kind of beefed up that IQ a little bit to be considered gifted? So that's basically how we identify gifted students. And once they are identified, that's it. They don't get retested. It's not like a every year, let's see what goes on for identifying them again. It's done. Once you're gifted, you are gifted. Even if you move to Osceola County, you have to be in communication with other teachers to say, okay, so here, the paperwork that we keep on gifted students, it's not an IEP like ESE, it's an EP. So it's just an educational plan. So that educational plan transfers all throughout the state. I talk to teachers from all across the United States when my kids move, and then I have to send that educational paperwork as well, just saying this kid is gifted. Once you have it, you're identified as gifted for the rest of your educational career. So that's kind of the cool part about gifted is you don't lose it. It's not a, okay, well, I did really well on the test this year, but now next year I'm not doing really well. It's something that stays with you. That label does follow you, even in the grade book that we use for doing grades and identifying students, in Focus, which is what we use, there's even a little red folder that has a white L on it, and that indicates the student is gifted. So it lets the teachers know, okay, this kid is gifted. What do I need to know to kind of help with that kid?
Very, very interesting. And I hope we get, we're going to get more into some of those details because I know that there'll be questions about that. But I do want to go back to, you mentioned you got your bachelor's at Florida Southern with a major in history. Just for a little brief moment, can you tell us why you decided to do history?
Sure. I've always been a really big history nerd. Well, kind of in this office, you can see that's actually like a Florida Archives calendar. So I've always been super interested in history. I grew up in middle school and high school, always reading like the historical fiction books. So I was really interested. I started off as a theater major, and then I was like, I don't think this is what I want to do. So I started with history. I kind of really found my path. I really found my passion. And from that point, when I found something I was really interested in, I just thrived in college. So history was the cool way to go.
Yeah. And why did you choose to add on a secondary education major as well?
So I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. Once I was like, okay, I don't want to be a theater major. With history, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I'd always liked working with kids. I'd always liked working with people. So I was like, all right, well, let me add education on here. Let me see if I like it. And as I started doing the classes, I liked some, I didn't like some. When I did student teaching, I really didn't like it. I did not like the first two schools I was at. I was at one high school and it was terrible because the teacher, he just kind of was like, you want to teach today? And it was like Western, like early African history. And it was something I never heard of. And I was like, I don't know what this is. So that was tough. But then when I went to my final internship for that last semester of my senior year, I just loved it. I was at a middle school. The teacher I worked with, it was very much like a co-teaching organic relationship. So from that point on, I was like, I really like teaching. And actually from that, I've done a lot of co-teaching in this position, and I love co-teaching. Co-teaching is like my favorite thing because I love working with another teacher, getting to collaborate with them and work with them. So just another cool part about this job.
Yeah, and so secondary education, you were really looking at middle school and high schools to work with, is that right?
Yeah.
Have you ever done any experience in an elementary school?
Just transition meetings. When the kids' paperwork for gifted gets updated, I do go to the schools. So I've always gone for the 5th grade meetings. And I am not about the little guys. I don't want them touching and hugging me and being like, Miss Ernest, I love you. I'm just not, that's not my deal.
That's fair. That's fair. Other than Florida Southern, have you thought about continuing your education into a higher degree?
I have. I think if I were to go on to get a master's, I would get it in public history, because then what I could do is actually work in a museum and design curriculum and educational tours for students in the museum. So I think if I were to go on, that's what I get a degree in.
And what was that again? Master's in, what was it?
Public history.
Public history.
Mm-hmm.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah.
But it is for, you say it's for like education in museums?
Yeah. So basically with that degree, what you learn how to do is actually how to like set up different displays and how to work in a museum setting and how to make that effectively. Yeah.
That's really cool. That's really cool. Okay. So you mentioned that after you got your degree in education, you were ready to start teaching. What you said you started working at Boone? Was that the first school you worked at?
It was, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your time at Boone Middle School?
Sure. So when I was first hired, I was hired, I think 2 weeks before school started. I was, searching. It was at a time period when I graduated in 2013. There wasn't a whole lot of teaching jobs out there. Because I did go to school in Polk County for college, I did want to stay in Polk County because I already knew the teacher evaluation system. I knew how to access curriculum maps. I kind of knew what it was going to be like. So I found Boone Middle School. I applied. I was hired. I thought I was hired for a 6th grade world history position. I wasn't. I was hired for a 7th grade civics position. And I did not know a lot about civics. I really didn't. When I took the professional certificate, no, the subject area, I actually failed the first time I took that test because of the civics and government portion of the test itself. And so when I was hired and I came in and they told me it was civics, I mean, of course I said yes because I wanted to take a teaching job, but I was kind of terrified. And the other teacher that taught in the same subject area, he and I think, spent the first month looking at maps of the United States, which was not really what we were supposed to be doing because we just didn't really know how to start. But having that foundation and having another co-teacher or having another teacher next door that taught the same subject area, we really just bounced ideas and collaborated so much. I think it got us through that first year because it was his first year teaching as well.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So yeah, we were both kind of lost, but I think we found our way. And then by the second year, he and I we were grooving. We knew what we were doing. We knew what worked. We had some of the stuff from the year before. The second year, I took a reading endorsement that summer. So I also took a critical thinking class, or I taught a critical thinking class in addition to teaching civics. And it was tough. Civics is one of those classes with an EOC, and I love civics. I think it's totally interesting. I think it's probably one of the most interesting history classes you could take, but it was hard. And it was hard because of the fact there was an EOC and there was additional pressure to make sure the students were passing the assessment. So it was tough.
Yeah. What is something that maybe you learned teaching that 7th grade civics class that you've carried with you in your teaching career?
I think you don't really learn until you're in the classroom that the human beings that are sitting in front of you are more important than anything else going on. You got goals you have to get to, and you have things you have to, sorry, the bell.
No worries.
You have things you have to get through curriculum wise, but you gotta, it's kind of that Maslow hierarchy of needs. You have to make sure that child in front of you is okay. If they're sitting there, because something happened last night, or they're bawling their eyes out, or something happened in the hallway, they're not going to hear a single word of what's going on. So you have to be able to connect on a human level with those kids. And it can be scary. I was really young. I was 22 when I started teaching. So I was scared to reach out and kind of be a human with those kids. But that's something, and especially just as I've learned over time, is you have to connect with them, or you're just never, it's not going to be successful for anybody.
Okay, I took a little pause there because we had an announcement, so I didn't want that to interrupt. But Israel wants to know, what made you continue your special gifted teaching, and what was your driving force?
Sure. For me, when I started in this position, I was still kind of learning what gifted was, but I had the chance to work with some really wonderful administrators that I started to learn and grow as a leader. I started doing all these different projects. I started working on National History Day, which is a competition that is history based. And I also got to work with students. And my first year at Daniel Jenkins, I did that. One of the students was gifted, one of the students was not. I worked with another teacher and I said, you know what? I bet you we can make this into a class. And so we brought it to administration and they said, okay. So we found kids, we taught it. We taught it for 4 years, and every year the kids went to state, and it was like the coolest thing ever. But it was because I had a really strong administration that said, hey, you can do the thing. I see Chase just commented on there. He was in that first class, that class with Miss Smith and I.
He was really excited about seeing you today. He was
unbelievably excited. Unbelievably.
It's so cool. It's so cool because the other teacher I co-taught with was Miss Smith. And so when I saw Chase on the orientation videos, I was like, Chase is like a grown up and he's like a leader in the school and it's so cool. And so I sent the email that you sent me back to her. And so then we both were like fangirling and we're like, we're not going to cry because we're not babies, but it's so cool.
I know, it was so crazy.
It's really, I don't know.
It's awesome to see the kids that you get to have an impact on, really grow up and flourish and see what they get to do. It is really awesome.
Exactly.
Okay, so after, how long were you at Boone for?
So I was at Boone for 2 years, and then I was in the middle school itinerant position for 5 years. And now this is my first year doing the high schools as itinerant gifted.
Okay, so you went from Boone to working as an itinerant gifted teacher. And I'm trying to write this down. We are taking notes on your speaking engagement today. No worries. But you were a itinerant gifted teacher for the middle schools.
I was, yeah.
Okay.
So I was at Boone Middle School 1 day a week. I was at Lake Alfred before it was Lake Alfred Polytech 1 day a week. And then because there were so many gifted students at Daniel Jenkins Academy, I was at Daniel Jenkins Academy 3 days a week. And then over time, I dropped Lake Alfred after the first year. I kept Boone for 2 more years. And then after that, because the program kept growing and I kept growing as far as what I was doing with the students, the district reshuffled the positions so that way I could stay at Daniel Jenkins full time. And that's what I did for 2 years.
Okay, all right. So most of your career, most of your career has been doing this itinerant gifted for both middle schools and high schools in our area.
Yes.
Based on your experience, what was the learning process like for you? Was there any time for you to kind of take in this new role as the gifted teacher? What was that process like?
So my first year doing gifted, I had gone to a charter school and come back to Polk County. So I started at the end of September. And about the first week, I just had no idea what was going on. I was following another ESE teacher. He was the LEA at Daniel Jenkins Academy. And so I didn't really have access to anything. And so I just kind of followed his lead. I walked through classes. I walked through like the duties he had every day and did them with him, like things like lunch duty and like afternoon dismissal. That's what I really did. And then after that, I started getting signed up for the actual gifted endorsement classes. And that gave me a lot better idea of what I was supposed to actually be doing. And then from there, it really took me till about the fourth quarter to really find my groove as far as, what classes do I want to go into to be working in those classes with students? How comfortable was I with certain teachers? Because some teachers just don't want another teacher in there. And so I had to learn a couple lessons about, what was effective. Was it going to be effective if I was in that classroom, or was it just going to make that teacher uncomfortable? So it really took me till about that last quarter of my first year to really find my groove as far as what it meant to work with gifted students. And then by the second year, I'd really kind of figured out what gifted was. I'd figured out my kids, and I figured out what worked for me as far as my schedule.
Do you face any resistance from students, teachers, and parents when you're going through this process of, identifying gifted students and working with them?
Yes. It's different for all of those questions.
Okay.
Uh-oh. Hold on.
No worries. We can wait.
Oh. So I'm sorry, it's kind of like the first day of school all over today with everybody kind of schedules
I'm
adjusting.
sorry if we're interrupting. Let us know if
No.
you go.
No, you're totally fine. The room that I'm in at Boone, they've amplified the speaker because it didn't work at first. So now it's like the voice of God entering the room every time someone gets on the intercom. Resistance. So it's different depending on the level, as far as like, are they in elementary, middle, or high school?
Okay.
For resistance. From teachers, I really have to break down the process quite often of what it means to be gifted, because a lot of teachers come back to me and say, this kid's not gifted. And I'm like, well, actually 2 psychological assessments say otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be a struggle because people think that gifted is the nerdy kid sitting in the corner of the room doing all their work. And that's just not what gifted is. Gifted can sometimes be the person in the classroom who is hanging off the walls maybe just barely irking by what the rules are. Maybe they're the ones constantly shouting out in class. They're not that perfect student. There's a lot of different idiosyncrasies with gifted students that people just don't really understand. They actually develop, sorry, they develop asynchronously. So what that means is this is how a normal student would develop. It's just like a normal incline. A gifted student will develop asynchronously. So their intellect will be all the way up here. Maybe they're reading at a 12th grade level when they're in 4th grade, but their maturity is still down here with their peers. So it may even drop a little bit lower than their peers. So people look at me and say, that kid's not gifted. And I'm like, well, maybe look at how they're working. It might be a certain subject area like reading or math that they just excel at, but they still have the same strengths and weaknesses like other kids. So a lot of idiosyncrasies with that sometimes teachers can be resistant to. For parents, sometimes they don't want that label for their child. They just don't want to label. Sometimes they're very insistent that their child is gifted, when a lot of times they're just very high achieving and very bright. That's not a bad thing. Sometimes gifted comes with a lot of trials and tribulations that just being very bright doesn't. So especially like in elementary school, where they just want that status of, oh, my child is gifted, right, they can get upset about them not actually being identified as gifted. For students, sometimes I try to kind of stay in the background. I try not to pull kids out of classes too much. I'd rather go in and talk to them because I don't want to make it a point of contention where they're kind of being, picked out in a room as far as, oh, that's the gifted lady, so that means that kid's gifted. So, just like anything, they just don't want to be, different. And so sometimes some students absolutely love talking to me. I love talking with people, so I love doing that too, but some kids just don't want anything to do with me. So that resistance is just kind of different on who it is and what the scenario is. High school's been kind of cool. Pretty much all the kids have been like, yeah, I don't know what this is, but let's talk about it. So it's been cool.
Yeah, that is cool. You mentioned some trials and tribulations that come with being a gifted student. Can you explain what those are?
Sure. So there is this, I was going to draw it and then I forgot. So there is this thing with gifted. It's called the bell curve. So let me draw it and then I'll do this. So with this curve, this is kind of what it looks like and it's backwards. Cool. So this is what
okay.
This is what it looks like as far as like an IQ assessment. So students that are ESC, they might have like specific learning disabilities. There might be different social and emotional needs that they have because they fall in this level of the curve. This is kind of going up. This is just your normal students. This is your high achieving students. Now, when you get over the gifted, this is the kind of the amount of kids that are being identified as gifted. They have some of the same social and emotional issues that you may find in students that have different like learning disabilities or maybe under that ESC spectrum. So something very common with gifted students is anxiety. When they get to high school or middle school, maybe they've just kind of coasted through the entire educational career. And then when they get to high school, they're like, oh, I don't know what this is. And so now they're having anxiety because they don't know it. They actually have to work to understand it. And so that gets to a point where either they have super bad anxiety because they don't know how to do any of this because they haven't learned the skills and don't know how to ask, or they just totally shut down because they're like, I don't know how to do this, so I'm just going to shut down because I don't want to have to figure it out because I've never had to do that before. That's really common for me. Socially, I have had some students that have been gifted that have skipped grade levels. And they're much younger than their peers. And it's back to that asynchronous development. Up here, intellectually, they're fine in the content, but with their peers, they just don't know how to connect. They don't know how to talk. They don't know how to sit next to someone and just like be a human being. So a lot of times those students will flock to teachers to try and make those actual connections because they're just not comfortable with their peers. So that's what I focus on a lot, is I try to check up on how they're doing socially. Do they have friends? Do they need help getting friends? Do they need help learning how to talk to others? Empathy sometimes can be an issue. Having too much empathy, feeling too many feelings. With COVID, I had a lot of students struggling because it's not just this is really scary. I think the world is ending and this is just what's going to happen. And so it just gets really big, really fast, because that's a common trait of gifted students. So those are some of kind of those trials and tribulations that this specific group of students may go through, but you're not going to know it if they're just sitting in the corner, just doing their work quietly. They're going to internalize it. Or if they're over there, maybe causing a ruckus in class, maybe the teacher just sees that as they're disrespectful, not, I don't know how to ask for help. So that can be, some issues with gifted.
Yeah. Ashley wants to know, has there ever been a certain point that has made you question whether or not this was the career for you?
Yes. After my second year at Boone, I really struggled. I remember having a very defiant group of kids, and I didn't know how to connect. Back to that, like connecting as human being things. Mm-hmm. I didn't know how to connect with them anymore. There's one specific class period where a kid cursed me out. Another kid just walked out of class. And another kid, I think it was something dumb. I think they just like refused to put away their phone or something. And I just lost it. I had planning after that, and the kids walked out, and I just sat in my class and I just cried for 45 minutes. And I was like, I don't think I can do this anymore. I think this is it. And I remember calling my dad, and he was like, nope, you got to show up. You got to go in the next day. You got to keep it up, because otherwise then, it's like they won. And so the kids the rest of the day knew I'm not a good crier. I totally puffy face. It was bad. And so the kids kind of knew the rest of the day that I'd been upset, because, for some kids, they're like, yeah, I made the teacher cry. But I showed up next day. I didn't leave early. You showed up, and I'm glad I did, because I kind of learned that, you can get through those days. And for me, I look back on that and I'm like, if I could have connected with that kid a different way, if I could have started that relationship a different way, I could have had a different end result. But, teaching's hard. There's going to be some hard days like that, but you gotta keep an eye on who you surround yourself with too, to kind of be that support system for you. Because when that happened, I went to the guy next door. He sat with me for a while. There was a math teacher across the hall. She was pumping me up. There's kind of all throughout the day, other teachers were checking on me too. So kind of having that group of people that take care of you is important.
Yeah, and sometimes, teaching can be a learning process as well. You learn from those experiences for sure. Yeah. I wanted to ask you additionally, how long have you been, you said this year is the first year you started with the East Area high schools, is that correct?
Yeah, yes.
So starting in a new kind of area, with new schools, and with COVID, how has this really changed your job? How has it changed your job?
It's changed a lot. I have had to learn really quickly about different things with high school that I've never had to deal with middle school. Things like high school credits. I had a whole new staff, which it's hard because people don't remember your face when you're wearing a mask. So it was hard. It was hard finding areas for an office. I'm in Haines City. I don't actually have an office anywhere. So I sit in another teacher's classroom because I just literally don't have anywhere to go. But that's kind of part of this position, is being very adaptable to that. Sometimes you're just going to get stuck at a desk sitting up in the media center, and you kind of got to be like, all right, you just got to be able to go with the flow with that. On that other hand, because of the fact that there's been so many kids doing e-learning on my roster, I have about 300 kids right now. And I would say about half of them are doing e-learning. And so I actually have kind of liked that, because now I'm getting to actually talk with kids through their email. I was doing it with Microsoft Teams before they kind of cut off that chat feature, but it's been nice to connect with the kids that way. It's also been nice because the kids that are on campus, it's a little easier to find them, pull them out of class, talk one-on-one with them. It's been easier to kind of grab them that way. But yeah, it's been a challenge doing this. I think it's just more of a challenge of getting to know everything and learn everything while trying to be very conscientious of, where I'm at, and being conscientious about things like signing in different schools and being very clear about that for things like contract tracing, because I'm at 3 different schools a day some days.
Right.
So it's been different.
Yeah. Ashley wants to know, when do you know how to evaluate or identify a gifted student? Great question, Ashley.
So typically in the high school setting, by this point, there's not a whole lot of identifying as far as gifted students, because those psychological assessments, they get a lot harder. So typically in the elementary school level, sometimes middle school, what will happen is a teacher will notice maybe the student's just excelling, maybe they're testing at crazy levels. Things like those STAR assessments we use a lot from like the beginning of the year. Sometimes they'll see that the test results are super high. Maybe they're super on it as far as answering questions. Maybe they have very intuitive responses to different questions that show different levels of critical thinking. So a lot of the time it's with the regular education teachers. They're the ones that are kind of picking up and being like, hey, I'm wondering if this kid might be gifted. And that's kind of that job of the teacher, the gifted too, is to make sure you're sending out exactly what it means to be gifted and different signs to look for those students. So then based on that, you can kind of decide, let's see if maybe they need to do an evaluation.
I guess when I think of gifted students, I'm thinking back to that elementary school model that you talked about where they take them out of class and they work on special projects. But is it really more work that a gifted student has to do? Like what's other things does a gifted student do once they are identified that are different from our ESE or even regular education students?
Sure. Sometimes it is more work as far as like they will be pulled out of a class, but sometimes like it'll be pulled out of a class to do the same skills. So it could be math, but it's project-based learning. So instead of we're going to drill times tables, it's let's go make a budget on something. Maybe it's let's figure out the coordinates so that way we can create something. So I don't think it's more work. I think it's just changing it. So that way it's being more rigorous and challenging for the kid, not just that typical, let's drill these vocabulary sentences and these words and then repeat them 15,000 times. Because gifted students typically don't process like that. Typically you say it a few times, and especially if it's an area of their strength, they got it. They're done. They don't need to do 20 times tables. They're good.
Okay. What about, you just started working with high school students, so, maybe this is a new area for you to think about as well, but, students leaving high school as a gifted student, what kind of opportunities or expectations do they or their families have about going and leaving high school?
Sure. So there are different gifted specific scholarships. There's one called the Scobie Scholarship, which is based off of, I think it was an engineer for NASA. So there's different like specific gifted scholarships out there. But as they're going out into college in the real world, that's something that I think that is very important for a teacher of the gifted, is they have to have some of those skills. Like I said, if they've never been challenged before or learned how to study or have learned how to face when something is challenging and to persevere, without those skills, college is, at some point in your life, you're going to run into that. So being able to help them with those skills and give them different strategies for dealing with that, I think is really important, because otherwise, they could get to college and they could really struggle.
Do you ever worry that there might be students who are falling through the cracks?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I get really, there is actually, and I tried to discuss this with my district coordinator for gifted, and I've also discussed it at the school level, is some different, not so much in Florida, but in different states, what they do is they actually give a school-wide evaluation where you take one of those psychological evaluations, like everybody takes it in like third grade. And so from there, you could see, is that preliminary score high enough? Because sometimes some of those biases, some of those behaviors of gifted students, they may not be seen as them being gifted. It may be more of like a defiant thing. It may be more of a, they can't focus, they're like everywhere. So sometimes those behaviors can be misinterpreted. So I worry that sometimes we do miss kids. And like I've said before, the psychological assessments, they get harder the older that you get. So if you were to take one of those as a senior, you're being judged on that level of what you should have learned and retained as far as verbal and nonverbal cues. Maybe you missed some of that. Maybe there was a struggle one year. Maybe you moved. So those might not be retained. And so if you're trying to test someone as a 12th grader, they may just not make the mark. But maybe even third grade, where things were all hunky-dory in their life, maybe they would have been identified, but they just never were.
So do you find that there may be students who, or maybe like, tested early and maybe just didn't quite make it, but then later you test them and you find that they actually score high enough?
Yes, that does happen. Sometimes parents will try to have their kids tested in like kindergarten, and sometimes they're just like not there yet. Sometimes they're not identified till later. And sometimes it could just be a circumstance. It could be maybe they're just really shy with the person they're testing with. I know if I was trying to answer questions with a lady I'd never met before, I would be a little nervous. I mean, it is a face-to-face test. You're thinking on the, you're thinking, trying to process quickly. So I think sometimes that it can be a fluke. And then, if they take the assessment again, then maybe like the next year, they'll be like, all right, we're good, you qualified.
Can you give us some insight into the gifted endorsement classes that you took? What are some of the things that they train you to do as a part of your job?
Sure. So the gifted classes, I can't remember all of them. I know there was one about like social and emotional needs, like gifted basically all of the classes focused around what does it mean to be a gifted? How do you identify a child that is gifted? How do you give them strategies in the classroom? What types of activities you can work on in the classroom with these students? How do you differentiate in a normal classroom? A lot of that is kind of what the classes were based off of. And kind of going through them, there were some things that seemed like they were just normal teaching things, and some things kind of like the asynchronous development, things like that you don't run into in normal education classes. So those were definitely very valuable.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us, you already gave us an example of the project-based learning that a gifted student might do, but could you give us some examples of other things that you might do to help their social emotional learning and differentiation, like when you're in the classroom?
Sure. So in the classroom itself, sometimes something big that I advocate with teachers is choice. Sometimes when teachers try to do a culminating activity, like at the end of a unit or a project or a quarter, maybe it's something as far as choice. Maybe these students identify with different strengths. Maybe they want to produce a piece of music reflecting on a piece of literature. Maybe they want to create something. Maybe they want to get up and give a speech. Maybe they want to create a website. So letting teachers learn how to give choice in the classroom is very helpful a lot. I mean, with all students, but specifically with gifted students, because sometimes if you just say, I want you to create a website based on what the disease was in this book and compare it to another one, sometimes they're just going to go off and they're going to explore and go to a whole different world that you never thought of. So encouraging that project-based learning and a lot of choice in the classroom, that's definitely how I try to encourage for like an enrichment model where there's different, gifted or non-gifted in the classroom. For consultation, a lot for me, like for social and emotional, I just try to check in on kids a lot and really just be like, hey, how are you as like a human being today? So just being another advocate, not like, hey man, you got a 57 in math, what's up? So just trying to, just be a human to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I also want to ask, do you ever, is there opportunities for you to share your expertise and training with teachers so that they can start to utilize some of these things?
Sure. Something I've started for the past couple of years is I do a little monthly newsletter called Gifted Gab. I just kind of make it one page, I make it brief, and I send it out to the entire staff just so they can see like 1 month maybe, like what does it mean to be a bright learner versus being gifted? Or how do you get identified as gifted in Polk County? Or maybe it's different technology tools that you could use for all kids in your classroom, but maybe that would help with those gifted learners as well. So I try to like send out newsletters. I do meet with teachers on a monthly basis. And when I do, they fill out, it's called a consult log, where they, talk about how that student's progressing. I write down comments. And then from there, I kind of always ask them, I get a feel for, as they're talking to me, like what they're working on, like what the curriculum's like. And then from there, I always offer up like, hey, do you want to collaborate together? Do you want to brainstorm for this project together? So I try to be really open for that, just because it's so much easier to try and do that when there's two minds thinking about it. So I definitely try to talk with teachers a lot and just be open with, hey, let's come up with this. Let's talk about this. So that way you can just collaborate effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you take us through a typical, like your typical schedule for a day, or I know you go to different schools on different days, so like what a week would look like?
Sure. So my schedule is especially funky this year because of COVID. Um, I, for me, what I've typically been doing is I do stay at Ridge, usually Mondays and Tuesdays. I'll try to stay there the full day. What I do is I come in, usually Mondays is I pull up on the grade book. I try to look at grades for all of my students. So I see, if there's any D's or F's, I just kind of make a note of it, or maybe I email the kid. I try to email the kid first and be like, hey, are you okay? Do you need help with this class? If that hasn't worked or I've gotten no response, I typically try to email or reach out to the parents. Sometimes I reach out to the teachers to see like if there's something specific going on. Wednesdays are typically my boon days. Sometimes I'll spend the full day here, sometimes not. So when I'm here, because I have such a small group of kids, I'm very well in communication with the families. I've talked to all of them multiple times during that first quarter, just because it's such a small group of kids. And then usually end of the week, I try to do Haines City. Sometimes I do 2 schools a day. I also have an office in Bartow at Gibbons Street, which is an elementary by the school board office. So I just kind of bebop around depending on what is needed that day. And I like that. I like being able to kind of float around, make my own schedule as needed. But the rest of the week is usually dedicated to consult logs, meeting with teachers, meeting one-on-one with them to get feedback about the students, collaborating with them. A lot of this year has been talking with parents. I think I get like a bajillion emails a day, I think just because this year is odd. And it's just basic questions that they just don't know how to find the answer to. Things with credits or things with Florida Virtual School and how you can add an online class. So just being another person and being accessible for the kids and being for those parents. So that's, I think, pretty much typically what my week looks like.
That's really cool. I think that's a really cool schedule that you get to do. If you don't mind, you were a classroom teacher and now you're the teacher of the gifted. What was, some of these students are looking at kind of salaries and what these jobs are like. If you don't mind sharing, how did that influence your decision, if it did at all, moving up? Did you get a salary bump? Were you able to get more benefits or anything like that?
It's the same because It's still a teacher position. So the only thing that's changed is this year because it's itinerant and the way it's coded as like a district personnel. Mm-hmm. The only thing that's changed is the evaluation system. Is I'm evaluated as a non-classroom teacher, as opposed for the past 7 years, I've been evaluated as a classroom teacher. But yeah, the salary is the same. Everything's pretty much the same as far as benefits and, coverage and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, thank you. So the evaluation system you mentioned, just to briefly go over, teachers are evaluated on classroom observations from people coming in and observing what they're doing in the classroom, as well as the data that they provide either through their SAO or through a VAM score. What is different about your evaluation?
So it's always been a little weird as gifted. So it got a little easier because when I was evaluated as a classroom teacher, even though I had a specific group of students I followed, I would still receive data just from school-wide averages. So I would actually go in and take over classes and teach like formal and informal lessons when I was evaluated as a classroom teacher, even though it wasn't my classroom, they weren't my students. So it was always kind of odd, but they just never really had a good way to fit us in the evaluation system. It wasn't just like everyone fits in one bubble sort of deal. But now that I'm in this position, I'm evaluated as a non-classroom teacher. My SAO that I wrote actually focused on the teachers more than it focuses on the students. So it focuses on how you work with teachers, things like that Gifted Gab newsletter, collaborating with them on how to differentiate in the classroom. It's kind of more evaluated as far as how successful they're being working with those gifted students, specifically some of the gifted underachievers. That's kind of what our evaluation system is doing these itinerant positions.
That's really interesting. Mm-hmm. I have kind of just one last question for you, because I don't want to take up too much of your time. But if a student was interested in your role, or we've got a couple of seniors in here, we've got some freshmen, some sophomores, some juniors. what advice might you give them as they are looking at their future?
I would just find something you're passionate about and go with it. For me, I'm definitely very passionate about history. That's my jam. I love it. I'm super nerdy. I love talking about it. And that's what I've done is I have made this position where I still get to honor that and still get to be really involved with history and things that go along with that, while also advocating for this group of students that sometimes people just don't really think about that need an advocate. So find something you're passionate about in education. There's a whole world out there as far as different positions and pathways that you can take. It doesn't have to be a one size fits all. Even though I've done gifted and I've been doing gifted for several years, what I do as a gifted teacher is totally different compared to what another high school itinerant teacher has done, or what some of the elementary school teachers have done. Everything is different. And as long as you're very flexible and you find something you're passionate about, teaching's really cool. It really is. And it's so cool. It's so cool to see kids grow up and like be successful. Like the thing, sorry to keep picking on Chase, but like seeing kids grow up and like go in these leadership positions and like really thrive. It's the coolest thing. There's nothing else. There was this summer, this is dumb, but there was a school board meeting where there was a former student of mine that sent comments in, and my husband walked in the door and I just started crying, and he's like, "What's wrong with you?" And I was like, "One of my kids commented on the school board meeting and it was the coolest thing ever." Because you just like invest so much of yourself in these people's lives, and it's the coolest. Being a teacher is really the coolest.
I have to agree with you. I absolutely have to agree with you on that. Ashley does have one more question. She wants to know, which did you enjoy most when it comes to teaching, being a gifted teacher or being a classroom teacher, and which was more difficult?
I really like both. When I was in the classroom, it's really cool to just get to close your door and be like, this is my domain, these are my kids, whatever's happening is out there, it's happening, but it's not happening in here. I think it's really cool to get to like design lessons and get to see them work out and get to evaluate in that way. But it's really cool being gifted because I kind of call myself like the cool aunt of classes, because I got to come in and do the fun stuff. Like, we're doing this really cool activity. And then when like you're not doing well on your grades or stuff or having to grade papers, I was like, okay, classroom teacher, bye. So they kind of had to deal with that stuff. So it kind of just depends on what you like. I liked doing all the extra stuff. I mean, being in a position like this, you do a lot of different duties. You do a lot of different, like when like we have different like PBS events or like school rallies and everything like that. People that are in positions like mine, we're the ones that get pulled for that. But I really like that. I think it's cool to get to be involved in all that kind of stuff. So I guess it just sort of depends on like what your preference is, but there's definitely, things I like for both.
Would you say they are equally have the same kind of challenges or the same kind of would you say they're kind of similar difficulties?
I think so. I think that the one nice thing about being in this gifted position is I don't take as much work home, which was definitely, I struggled with that life balance as a normal classroom teacher, which I think it's just because I haven't been teaching very long. But in this position, I definitely don't take as much home as far as like actual work I'm having to do. It's just more staying later at school for different events.
Very cool. Very cool. Does anybody else have questions for Mrs. Ernest before I let her go?
I feel like I talked a lot.
No, this is great. This is what you're here for. It's great. Ashley got some really good questions out. Is there anybody else who wants to ask a question?
I'll be answered all my questions.
Okay. Chase?
All right. So I do have a question. Noticing, like, since you've worked in gifted teaching and in regular classroom teaching, for me, I think the environment is super important where you're teaching. How can you say, like, have you noticed any ways that like the environment affected a student that you were teaching and their development? And if so, in what ways?
I think that a classroom environment, but also a school environment is very important. I have been at schools where you just walk on campus and it just feels very negative. That's one thing I'm really loving this year is high schools I'm really noticing are just they're very positive. They're very go with the flow. People are excited to be there and to work with other people. And some of the middle schools I've been at have been like that as well. And it changes because I think it's kind of top down. If your administration is at a good place where, things are positive and things are moving and grooving and everyone feels, trusted and respected, I think that kind of trickles down all the way to the students. So I would definitely say, keep an eye on your administration, because that's really going to influence a lot of that climate. Because ultimately, when it comes down to it, is if you as the teacher, if you're having a hard day or if you're struggling, as much as you want to keep that out of the classroom, and you can most of the time, sometimes it's going to trickle down to kids. So making it like mentally for yourself, picking a more positive environment, I think goes to be more productive for everyone. But also on that same coin is, sometimes you're going to be in situations where maybe it's not, maybe something happened that day, and maybe something, the staff's down, or maybe you're just not feeling it. Is trying to be in control of your own like emotions and trying to produce that positivity and putting it back into your kids in the classroom, I think can be really powerful.
Cool. Thank you. I just wanted to ask. Appreciate it. I do keep my school the best. I know when you go to Ridge and you see the difference at Haines City. I know I do great. I do a great job.
You really love Ridge. I really do. You find me, I'm at Ridge almost every day just because I love coming there, because everyone's so nice and the kids are nice and the staff is nice. So every time I'm on Ridge's campus, I'm like, oh, I like it here.
It's because they have a good president. That's why. I mean, that's what I've heard at least. I don't know.
Good senior class president for sure.
Well, that's like the top down, like I was saying, starts with the senior class president.
And our Student Government Association is going to be involved in a school beautification project in the next coming weeks. So not only will the mental environment be positive, but hopefully our physical environment will also be taken care of as well.
Awesome.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for talking to us, Ms. Ernest. It's been a real pleasure. I learned a lot about Gifted and what you do. I really didn't realize that it was so extensive. And so I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. This has been cool. I hope it's kind of given everybody a little piece of information, and everybody's learned a little something today.
Definitely. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Bye.
All right, guys. So great. I want to make sure I stop the